it's live. I will be clapping once at 1 minute, another time at 7 minutes, and then twice at 8 minutes. If you're over 8:15, I'll clap 3 times. Bit awkward, so don't do that to me, please. POIs between 1 and 7. Again, don't make me yell at you for not doing POIs in the right times. So yeah, that's what we've got here. I'm your chair. I'm not an adjudicator. I'm just here to cheer you on. So are we ready to rumble? Yes. Ready to rumble. Let's go. So let's open up this debate with Guy, first speaker of the affirmative team. Stella McKenzie says, yeah, Guy, go, 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 go.
Again, watching all my debates so far. Oh. I know the Christian solidarity is really going strong. Panel, it's simply not good enough for opposition to tell a single mother dying of cancer, who can't play with her kids because of the pain, who sees no way out of her situation, that she has to wait 12 years for a cure. We tell you 12 years is going to be too late. She'll be dead in 12 years. Give her the option to be a part of her kids' lives. Side with affirmative. What? Okay. In this debate, we're going to win by showing that we improve medical outcomes for the most vulnerable. 3 arguments. Firstly, on why it's overwhelmingly likely that these medications will work as intended and be really effective. Secondly, how we improve health and life outcomes for both these individuals and the broader population. And Valentina will split to you on why this leads to more innovation. But what's our policy? 6 things. Firstly, we're going to implement this option to take this medication for the wider public after these animal trials are promising. It's crucial to note that this is the point at which generally things go, you're about to go to human trials, so these humans are going to be taking the medication anyway. We just broaden that scope. Secondly, in order to sign up for this, you're going to have to be corpus mentis. We think there's existing good structures that exist in society on things like euthanasia in order to ensure that there's not going to be duress by family or doctors here. It's important to note that these doctors are not going to shove this medication down these people's throats. It's going to be presented as an option with that full declaration. We're happy to have things like kind of consent forms that get this. Thirdly, we tell you that these medications are going to be presented to patients by doctors at the point at which other options are exhausted and there's no kind of FDA conventional medications for them to go on, or they're not going to be effective in that situation. Fourthly, we just tell you that this process is going to be accompanied by monitoring. 2 things. 1, there's going to be regular checkups with healthcare professionals to monitor these vital signs. So if in the instance that anything does go wrong, you're able to get onto that early, you're able to get off the medication, you'll be able to get those benefits. But secondly, we just tell you that this data is going to go to these pharmaceutical companies, so they're better able to improve their medications and better able to get through the FDA process faster. Fifthly, we tell you that these are going to be offered at no cost. And finally, we tell you that companies are going to volunteer. On that. Now starting on why it's overwhelmingly likely that these medications are going to work as intended. The starting point for this argument is that we already accept a degree of side effects, along with medications and lots of things in society. 2 reasons. 1, we just tell you that a lot of these side effects pale in comparison to the actual benefit that you get from taking these medications. It's always going to be better than the comparative. That looks acne medication Oratane having some implications for depression and liver functioning, but you still are able to take that if you're doctors are still able to offer you that, even though there's that side effects. But secondly, we just tell you there's always flow-on effects. People can choose not to exercise, people can choose to have poor diets. Those are medically bad. We tell you that these things already exist. 5 reasons why it's overwhelmingly likely that these medications won't be intended. Firstly, we just tell you reading the info slide, these promising lab trials are really important. That necessarily means that we also know the improving nature of these animal trials and these medical trials, and that you're able to we understand the genome to a point where you can actually have more better simulations, and that these human trials are much less likely to go badly. Secondly, we just tell you that these pharmaceutical companies have immense reputational incentives, and that they're not going to want to put out something way too early and that's not going to benefit people. approval. That's really important because these companies who tend to be doing this research tend to be big companies with lots of interest. They're not going to want to cut corners. They're going to make sure that medication is good. Thirdly, we tell you a lot of that 12 years that you get on their side of the house is not necessarily spent exceptionally well. We tell you the FDA is an incredibly huge bureaucracy, which means that a lot of it is just spent on things like paperwork, not necessarily going on things like actually getting these trials, which are actually going to meaningfully improve those medications. We tell you that after those animal trials, it's incredibly important that you're not going to get too much improvement there. Fourthly, we just tell you that doctors are going to cater this to the people who are actually applicable for. If you know that you've got a pre-existing condition which might dispose you to a bad effect of a medication, the doctors aren't going to propose that because that's not necessarily going to be that it's not going to add that value. But secondly, we just tell you that these reputational incentives still operate on these doctors, and they're not going to want to force this medication on people because we're happy to have things like oversight on those medical fields, which are so important. Fifthly, here we just tell you that we're going to have quick reactions to change. So at the point at which some people even if you get some side effects on their side of the house, if those are catastrophic, we can stop giving people this medication. We're going to find that early because as we told you in the model, we're getting that regular medical checkups. That's so important. What are the outcomes of this? That's these 5 reasons mean that almost in every case, this medication is going to work. The side effects are not going to be significant. It's going to be really, really beneficial. That means that Ned can't come up here and claim a massive harm on this, and that we tell you that this degree of risk that exists with side effects is comparable to other things in society, other medications. I'll take a POI.
With a single cancer drug failing after literal animal tests, how will that not fundamentally disrupt and undermine faith in the medical system?
Okay, we tell you that there's still going to be faith in the medical system because people are what really gets people disillusioned with the medical system is waiting 12 years for that cancer drug, is not being able to access that even though it's working because of that FDA bureaucracy. That's why you get disillusionment with this system on their side of the house. Okay, how we improve health and life outcomes. The starting point to this is that these diseases tend to be chronic and terminal. 2 reasons. Firstly, this is where most of the research is taking place because these issues are urgent and people want to have stuff here. But secondly, we tell you that these people who face these very serious harms have the most incentive to go on this medication because their quality of life. Okay. Why do we improve these outcomes? 6 reasons. Firstly, we just tell you that the quality of life is exceptionally low at the point at which these people are in constant pain, at the point at which these people fear death all the time, and these people who don't have the mobility to go outside, go to their park, play with their kids. That's a huge harm. Even if we're able to improve that quality of life through that medication. But secondly, we just tell you that this medication not only improves the quality of life, but also just the quantity of life because it is really life-saving. It has had these promising trials. That's so important because you're not going to get that on their side of the house because people are going to pass away before it actually gets through approval. Just note on this quality and quantity of life thing, the impacts this extend beyond the immediate person because these family members are and their family and friends are able to enjoy these last years of their life, and they're actually able to have that meaningful interaction. That's so important because they're here. Okay. Fourthly here, we just tell you that there's data available for general population. This is because there's people on this medication, so these pharmaceutical companies are able to get data on how this is working and that best able to get through that FDA approval in a much faster way. That means that even if people who wait for that FDA approval are going to get that medication earlier in society, that's really, really important because we actually improve the structural barriers that exist with the FDA. We just a note on the 12-year thing being really long. Even if there are side effects for things. Firstly, we can note that these things happen over the longer term. Sure, you might have elevated blood pressure 20 years from now, but you're not going to be alive 20 years from now unless you're on that medication. Secondly, we just tell you these parallel comparisons with the problem. Thirdly, the health checkups are going to get this. What are the outcomes of this? We get the medications to the people who actually need them. They're the most important people in this debate because they're living out their last years with their family. They're able to enjoy their quality of life on our side of the house. We only get that on proposition we propose.
Thank you so much, Guy, for that fantastic speech. I now invite the negating team with Ben to get up and open the negating side of this debate. Woo! Thank you, Ben.
In the 1960s, a new wonder drug arrived in the hands of pregnant women across the world, something that could help cure their awful morning sickness. What these people did not know is that this drug, thalidomide, had not been tested properly, and as a result, millions of babies were lost and the rest were born with stunted limbs. This is not something we can stand for on this side of the house. We cannot support the use of the premature testing of medication that are being released into the public because we do not know what will happen in the end. Most likely, there will be more harms than benefits occurring in these scenarios. This is what we stand for. What we support in this debate is the status quo, where regulations exist and are upheld because that is the way that we can guarantee that medications are 100% safe by taking the bureaucratic process, the non-corrupt process, and making sure that drugs end up safe when they come out of trial. What we see in this scenario is that when the need for medical treatments is extreme, like with COVID, we can inject extra funding into these facilities so they can fast track the use of this medication. For example, when the World Health Organization put crazy amounts of funding into fast tracking the COVID vaccine and no corners were cut in the doing of that. What we don't support is public access to early stage medical treatments because they hurt the reputation of reliable medicines and the lives of desperate people around the world. The main stakeholder in this debate for the negative team is the inhabitants of the developing world. This is because they're the most vulnerable to poor medical outcomes and being exploited, and because they make up 80% of the world. They are the most population stakeholder in this group. So we win by showing that these people suffer so much from accessing undeveloped medical treatments. First point, why it is really dangerous to release this medicine. Secondly, why this medication will erode people's trust in modern medicine. And thirdly, the emotional impact of taking this medicine for people. Now, into some rebuttal. So the first speaker's speech was basically about how their medication is going to work, but it still will be safe. My whole speech today is proving to you why that is untrue. But two little subpoints from that. First of all, they've talked about it taking too long, the bureaucratic process to get medicine through. We say that it takes a long time so that we can follow an uncorrupt process which results in a medicine we know is 100% safe, or at least know the risks of when minorities are taking this medicines that haven't been trialed properly on. We see that this is a very positive benefit because it means doctors who prescribe this medication or suggest it know what they're talking about and know the risks behind what they're doing. Thirdly, they also said that people taking medication suffer terminal illness. I'll correspond with this directly later in the debate. So it's my first point. Yes, actually.
What does your side have to say for the thousands of people who die from preventable causes, all because bureaucracy is too slow?
Okay, we're going to talk about this a lot later as well, so I'll just come to it when it arrives. So basically, context is my first point, which is why this medication is really harmful and allows big pharmaceutical companies to prey on disadvantaged people. Context for this point, three really key pieces of context for this debate. Firstly, big pharmaceutical companies do not care about people, they're profit driven. We see this in examples where medicine for HIV is sold for $700 in America when its market price should be $10. The cost of production for it is about $4. It's ridiculous. We see through this that they are profit driven heavily. They do not actually care about people's needs. They only sell drugs because they are extremely profitable. They can gain a high price because they're an inelastic good that don't have any subsidies. Second piece of context. People in developing nations are most likely to make poor medical decisions in the world when we release untested medicine. This is because there's poor funding for education in these countries, because maybe people dropped out so they could work for their family and gain an income, or maybe just there is poor education. They didn't learn while they were in school. What this means is that literacy rates are low and scientific literacy is low in these countries. And because of that, they're more likely to take these medicines over everyone else because they're not able to properly analyze the risks behind doing so. Thirdly, developing countries tend to be more corrupt than other countries because they have poor democratic systems. That means healthcare is generally privatized because the government cannot supply good facilities for medical care. And because of that, we find it will be very easy for doctors to spread misinformation around medicines because they are more likely to be corrupt, less likely to be held accountable by the government. Mechanisms for my point. Firstly, early trials for medications have a low, first of all, they just, the people, when you are designing a medicine for Pfizer, say in Europe, You are going to like strategically, like because you plan to sell it for lots of amount of money at the end of the process when it's made, design this medication to be for people in Europe who can afford this medicine, or in America. What this means is you're not designing it for people in, say, Southeast Asia or Africa who this like medicine, even if it's being like well designed in the lab, might not affect properly. Why is this? Because like different ethnicities are like slightly different biologically. Maybe there's a different enzyme in some person's body. Maybe they have a different blood type. It's completely realistic. Like, and through that, we see that there's examples when you might design a medicine that works for someone but doesn't work for someone else. So what have we identified in this debate? The people that are going to be most affected are people from developing countries, because my second mechanism, like doctors are just going to exploit patients in developing countries, because firstly, they're more likely to be corrupt, as I explained before, which means that they're like not going to do checkups directly, like responding to their rebuttal. They're not likely to do checkups for like pharmaceutical companies, because the pharmaceutical companies want to sell this medicine and they want to look good in the long term, so they don't want repercussions to come back to them when they sell bad medicine. So what this means is that like you're likely as a doctor in these countries to offer a drug in scenarios where it might actually be too risky. Like for example, if there is a cancer treatment available for a person but it's expensive, so you just offer the cheaper version which has a 10% chance of killing you. Like there's that opportunity, and these doctors will take it because they're corrupt and they want to make money in a lot of circumstances. And even if it doesn't happen in every circumstance, the fact that this is unique to their side of the house, the fact that we can prove in some circumstances it will happen, is a harm that we're not willing to take. This is the comparative on our side of the house. We prevent this from happening full stop. We prevent people from dying unnecessarily. Second point, which is why people lose faith in medicine overall if we release these drugs. Mechanisms for this point are if you release a drug and then that drug is not like helpful for people who are suffering from an illness, but when it comes out of like its development, it is helpful for people on the basis that like your grandma or whatever who took this drug and died from it or suffered really bad health implications from it, you are not likely to take this drug even when it is safe. There is that like incentive behind there because you've had past bad experiences with the early trials of this drug not to want to take it. This means people are going to have a bad association around what like medicine is. People are unlikely to look at medicine and decide that it's like the right thing to take for them because they have these past misconceptions. They have these stories about people from their ethnicity who suffered negative repercussions. And therefore, we see that people in the future who could be taking medication, like, and knowing that it is safe for them, aren't going to be able to do so because they aren't going to be like sure that it's the right thing for them to take. They aren't sure if it's going to be completely healthy for them because they know people in the past who have not benefited from it. This again is something unique to their side of the house. We do not have it. On our side of the house, also, just to point out with their rebuttal, that like, so how do I phrase this? People who are receiving medicine, that we're going to save more lives by allowing people to feel comfortable taking medicine than the lives that might be lost by people not being able to take medicine through fast-tracking these trials with that life-cutting illness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to get.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm not crying about anything that you said. It's a very sensitive topic for me. I really apologize. I hope that didn't distract you.
It's all good. So if we're all ready, we can move on to second speaker from Affirmative, Valentino.
The SI fails to recognize the comparative, right? The SI fails to recognize the situation where 12-year-old individuals still die, right? They fail to recognize the comparative that the only kinds of individuals who are likely to take, medicines that have these kinds of risks are individuals who know that they are under so much like duress, they're under so much risk of death, and no other treatments have worked, that this is their only choice, right? They fail to engage with the comparative that in this like third world situation they want to talk about, we don't see why doctors are any better on their side, right? So what do we think this debate is about, right? First of all, we think it's about the issue of whether it's safe. It's about the issue of which side actually saves more lives, and lastly, I'll split to you about telling about why it leads to more innovation, right? So why do we think it's safe, right? Because the SI has essentially predicated a lot of their case on essentially it not being safe because it'll be just like spread out in the third world. Why do we think this is not the case? First of all, we think that this debate is probably set in Western nations on account that the info slide was about the FDA, right? We think that we'll mostly look at the US. But even if we want to talk about developing nations, we'll talk about it, right? So they claim that doctors in all these nations are all corrupt, right? First of all, we think that no, they have medical licenses and they do have things to account for, right? But also, second of all, we think that they take the Hippocratic oath, like they have some integrity there. But also, lastly, when they talk about the issue of corruption, okay, if they are corrupt and the government's corrupt, then why aren't these companies on both sides just lobbying the government and putting untested drugs in both worlds, right? So we think that in this sort of situation, it's equivalent on both sides, right? We don't think that like us allowing it under like all our model regulations suddenly like means it can't happen on their side or isn't already happening if they want to claim that everything is so corrupt. But also we've told you that there are a lot of regulations that we are putting in place as part of our model, right? We've told you about how doctors need to give full information. We've talked about how doctors aren't allowed to pressure. We talked about the monitoring system, right? We talked about all these sorts of things that in which patients are not pressured. We've talked about all these things in which patients are informed about the sheer risk, right? They're going to be informed about the risk of long-term effects. They're going to get informed about the risks of failed pregnancies and things of that nature, right? We think that what occurs is that first of all, we think that the type of drug they're taking end up being like life-saving. But second of all, we think that individuals, even if they are like from uneducated third world countries, as they wanted to assert, which we think is like, okay, whatever. But if they really want to assert that, we think that these uneducated people can still weigh up the value of their own lives, right? If the doctor tells you that this medicine might kill you, you're probably still able to weigh that up. But they want to say that like doctors aren't going to tell them anything. It's just like a recommendation, like shoddy drugs. We say that happens in both worlds. We think that like both worlds are equally immoral, right? But second of all, so which side actually ends up like saving more people, right? So they wanted to talk about people being slightly disillusioned with the medical system. First of all, we think the likelihood of so we told you about why there are many reasons why we think individuals aren't going to die, right? Like companies have reputation to uphold. We've talked about like how lab trials have improved in the modern day, right? Modern data analysis, modern computer science has allowed us to like model the human genome and everything of that nature. It allows us to accurately test. We've talked about how doctors need to present full information. We've talked about regulatory agencies, and we've talked about but we've also talked about like, all the information, right? So we don't really see why individuals actively knowing that this is a test drug is suddenly going to like discredit the entire medical system, right? We don't see why that happens. But even if like as the example occurs, like one individual has their like grandma die of this test drug, and then they decide not to take this drug, we say that first of all, like the grandma was going to die either way. But second of all, we think the likelihood that like both of these individuals have the exact same disease is like just such a rare circumstance. We think that it's highly unlikely, and we are more than willing to take the risk if it means like 50 or 100 more people who do take this test drug end up surviving, right? We think that's the comparative. But second of all, we've also told you how we improve the medical system in terms of like speeding up the pipeline, right? And recognize that we've told you a lot about bureaucracy, right? We've told you that what they wanted to frame as, oh, they're taking 12 years to do the accurate checks into each and every piece of data. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that there are thousands and thousands of medical patents in the FDA pipeline that need to be approved, right? That's what all those years are. So we don't think that what they're trying to claim about like an enormous amount of tests just suddenly appears. But also lastly, in terms of like the kind of harms that are weighed up in both worlds, realize that there are still human trials under their side, right? Someone is going to suffer from side effects. Someone is going to have to, if this drug really is that deadly, we think some human still has to take it. They still suffer all the harms that they want to discuss. Before I go on, any go on?
Look, if someone close to you dies, how does that not create a strong emotional response that translates to a complete like disengagement with the medical system and scientific framework?
Well, first of all, we think that like some degree of like questioning of the medical system is good in terms of things like second opinions. But second of all, we think that this is like, first of all, we think that second of all, we think like this kind of circumstance we've already told you is highly unlikely. But third of all, we don't think that just because like you see like one statistic of like someone dying of a vaccine doesn't mean you like just ignore vaccines as a whole and like try to discredit them, right? We think that many people generally trust the medical system and have been like are involved in it actively. But also, if an individual is at risk of actively dying because they don't take medication, realize that like your distrust for the medical system and the risk of your own death, you're probably going to want to at least take that risk, right? We don't see why the way up suddenly like disappears, right? So we think that really the sort of hesitancy stuff is like minimal at best. We don't think it should be weighed in this debate. What should be weighed in this debate is a situation where 12 years of lives are actually saved, right? But we think that it extends even further, right? So why do we think that this leads to innovation? Recognize that we've told you that the FDA's ability to pass medicines is improved, right? Why do we think this is the case? We've told you that it's because when you go through like regulatory agencies as one of the parts of the steps, we think it becomes a lot easier for them to weigh when they have more data, right? When they have the live test results through all these things, right? And we think it's easier for them to just like toss out medicines that like have like failing results and things of that nature, and we think then generally those get stopped. But what we think happens is that if it becomes easier, that means the pipeline average time gets cut down, right? We think it, even if it's like from 12 years to 10 years, we think that's absolutely acceptable. Why do we think this is the case? Two impacts. First of all, we think it's the impact of the incentive to develop more treatments, right? We recognize that medicine development takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time, right? We think and we think there's more incentives on our side. One, because the time between the investment in these things and the result becomes shorter, and therefore we think that the ability to garner things like investment from investors, especially in the modern climate where like short-term investing is and retail investing is becoming a big thing, we think that is improved. But second of all, because the our results can actually be announced to encourage even more investing. But third of all, because they also mean you're willing to invest more because of returns and the opportunity cost being lower. But on the second layer, we also think this leads to the development of new medication, right? Because you're not encouraged solely to work on medication that like you can develop quickly and like you'll have to wait through and you want to like churn out into the FDA pipeline as soon as possible so you can get your 12-year stint over. We think that there's the incentive now to come up with medicine that helps like rarer diseases, right? So you have a temporary monopoly on this sort of thing because the investment is just more likely to give you the returns in the short term, right? We think the opportunity cost just changes, right? Where you want to invest your capital changes, right? So for all these reasons, what we've shown to you today is a case in which we're able to save lives for 12 years, where even if they want to say like 1 or 2 individuals really are at risk, we've told you that's minimal. We've told you why these companies have a lot of incentive to like ensure these medicines are at their best. We've told you why there's a lot of regulation and why governments have the incentive to do so. So proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Valentina. Now we're going to turn to Julia to do the second speech of the negating team. Woo! Go, Julia!
We can point to huge harms in the past of unregulated drugs having such a huge detriment to so many lives, and apps gives us no way of actually avoiding that in the future. For all we know, this kind of tragedies are going to happen again and again and result in so much suffering in human suffering, which is so bad. We can never stand for that on their side of the house. 4 things to do in my speech. Firstly, frame why it's important to consider the developing world context. Secondly, talk to you about how pharma and doctors are likely to respond. Third, talk to you about the safety and why it's unlikely to be very good on this side. Fourthly, on the emotional costs, and I'm going to weigh that all up at the end. So let's talk about framing in a third world context, because the first response is that it's not the third world context because it wasn't on the info slide, but we give you so many reasons why it's good to be, but we need to focus on the third world context. Firstly, because there's way less regulation, so the harms are way worse in that area. But secondly, just because so much of the population of the world, 80% lives there, there is so much more harm to be happening there on either side. It's really important to consider that. And then they gave us some reasons why they think that doctors will still be like good moral actors on both sides of the house. First, because of like the Hippocratic Oath. Firstly, because like we tell, they say the Hippocratic Oath will stop people, but we tell you that like money is probably a greater incentive for a lot of people in saving lives, especially when being a doctor is seen as a highly lucrative job and people are going into it as like to get money instead of actually save lives, as is the case in a lot of countries. And secondly, they tell us that it's like symmetric and pharma will be selling regulated drugs on either side of the house. We tell you firstly that if we don't allow this, then countries where pharma is based won't allow these countries to actually come to sell it in the first place in third world countries, so it won't happen. But secondly, it sets a giant precedent that it's okay if you are actually allowing them to sell it, so we think it's going to happen much more on their side of the house anyway, so that deals with that material. And they also say that people in the third world can also weigh up the harms and risks. We don't think it's true because they have so much more disinformation that they're actually unable to make that kind of rational weigh up, which means that they can't give that properly. And secondly, then on will it be safe? We give you like 5 reasons why it's not. Firstly, because animal trials simply are not in no world are they representative of the way that a human will respond to it. And also, Big Pharma can quite carefully choose animals that they know will respond well to the drug so that it looks really good and there's really promising results. Whereas that animal's immune system or entire biology is so different to how humans will react. So they can make it look really promising secondarily in the early trials with no hope of it actually working in a concrete way when it comes to humans themselves. Thirdly, we tell you because it's a really small sample size in early trials, it's really unrepresentative anyway. And finally, we tell you that it's really bad because often these trials, when they do get to human stages, are based off relatively rich white people who are like happy to engage in these trials, and there's just like simply more white people in Western countries where the trials take place. So it means that you don't actually get the kinds of nuance, and like that means that drugs can really badly adversely affect people of like different races because there is slightly, as being told you, there's some different enzymes that sometimes like affect the efficacy of the drugs, which is really bad. So we tell you that it's going to be unsafe. We got no responses to these apart from just like you can stop the drug if it's bad. But we tell you firstly the effects might be over a long time scale, that you can't just simply stop it. But secondly, the effects are probably quite likely to be permanent or even lethal, which means that you can't just go back on your thing because it's too late. And they also tell you that if they can have good oversight, we tell you this is simply not true because there's only to some extent that they're actually able to monitor what doctors are doing, but it's especially true in the developing world where these oversight boards simply don't really exist or are really not very powerful. It seems they're not able to do that. They also bring up innovation. They can get lots of whole new drugs. We tell you this is actually really bad because if farmers are incentivized to create drugs really, really fast, a whole lot of new innovation, that means even more risky drugs that are likely to actually have a whole lot of harm. We twist that back on them. And finally, they tell you that only people who are in really dire circumstances are going to use these drugs so they get no net harm. We tell you this is not true. Firstly, because we tell you that like when Big Pharma posits the drug or advertises it as really good, then people think that it is going to save their lives, even if it's not lethal. They might have a long-term health effect. They can then get that better off if they do take the drug. And secondly, we tell you that like it's really bad for society, even if there's like not too many harms on individual people, which I think there is. It's really bad in terms of creating distrust. It's really bad in terms of the emotional cost that I'm going to go through further in my speech, so that simply doesn't exist. How then onto how Big Pharma and doctors will respond? Because the Act tells you that like it won't be shoved down people's throats, but they give you no mechanism why this isn't true, right? Firstly, we tell you oversight is hard, as I said, especially in those developing nations, but it's also in developing nations. It's really hard to be checking up on your patients again and again and again when those resources are really stretched and you simply don't have time. So there's no evidence that it's actually going to be any kind of like meaningful oversight, especially in these developing countries, which tell you is the most important context and the most to lose there. Secondly, they tell you that Big Pharma won't act badly because it has to risk its bad reputation. But we tell you that this is actually more like the tragedy of the commons, right? People don't know which specific drug company manufactured the drug that they're taking. They just know that pharma made it, so then they associate it with that, and like pharma, it probably harms their competitors as much as it harms them when companies make these drugs. So I think there's not any disincentive there. And also they are looking for short-term gain to like give money back to their shareholders, and they can't see it a lot in the short term. So they are looking for that monetary gain that they can get in the short term. They're going to weigh that over potential long-term benefits that actually act the same on all the people in the pharmaceutical industry. Our more realistic material here is that farmer is going to cut lots of corners to get cash because it is profit motivated. We never got any response to this, which means that we think that it's highly likely that farmer and doctors will be pushing these drugs upon people or advertising it as really good and giving you exorbitant prices, especially when doctors are often have deals with farmers to sell their drugs so they can get more money and then get a deal out of that. Yes, I'll take a few right now.
If the developing world represents 80% of this market for the medications, why aren't these profit-driven big pharma firms going to cater to these people of colour?
We tell you that they simply can't because they're conducting trials within Western countries. They can't go out and do that, especially if they're doing animal trials as well. There's no ability for them to construct trials within these developing countries because they simply don't have time on your side of the house. And also they probably care less about the effects because they aren't being held as accountable anyway. So let's talk then in the emotional cost, and my split is going to be included within this. Firstly, we tell you that there's going to be a huge distrust of science to the point that people feel like drugs are really bad for them and they're therefore not going to take them, and they feel like medicine in general is going to be harmful because they're not going to take drugs that could actually save their lives down the future. The only thing that we got told in response is that people will weigh their own lives over this kind of fake information. That's not the real trade-off right here, because we tell you that when they get this information that medicine is harmful, people don't believe it's their life versus this drug. We think that they think that this drug could actually really harm them and actually kill them. So they feel like they are better off not taking it than actually dying because they hear that the drug is really bad. Then we also think there's a huge emotional harm here because you're giving people firstly a false hope, this is my substantive, because they believe that they do have salvation because of this drug. And then when it actually turns out to be really harmful or doesn't work, that kills all of your expectations of actually having a future life, which is so good personally for your family and also for yourself, as you don't have time to come to terms with that. And secondly, because of the huge cost, because these pharma aren't not going to be subsidized by the government because it's so new. It's a huge cost to families when they fork out to buy this drug, a huge substantive financial harm that they lose and get no gain because the drug simply doesn't work. So at the end of this debate, we prove a huge risk to people's lives on a foundational level, a huge cost because pharma is charging a lot of money and there's no subsidies. Thirdly, a detriment to the trust of science across the world, especially when it's being spread very fast through fake news and that kind of controversial information spreads very easily on social media. Fourthly, huge emotional harms when you're basically having your trust betrayed by big pharma. And we can also prove that you're rushing big drugs that aren't working well. They get maybe a tiny amount of lives saved, but the cost of so much, that's why we can never stand for their side.
Thank you so much, Julia. What a fantastic speech. Now we're going to move on and we're going to get the final substantive speech from the affirmative team. Ellen, I welcome you up.
At the point at which Nick's entire case rests on the fact that profit incentive is somehow going to drive doctors and companies to be corrupt, when we literally told you right at first in our model that these new treatments were going to be offered free to the patients, we think that they have already fundamentally lost this debate. But on top of that, I'm going to go into reasons why we have won on top of that, even if that doesn't stand. How are we going to win today's debate? Firstly, we're going to prove to you that our side saves many more lives than the other side does, and why this is the most important point in today's debate. And then finally, we'll discuss what sorts of reactions people will have as a response to them. Those are also my points of clash. On to the first point of clash, which side saves more lives? There were broadly two main questions under this point of clash. Three main questions. Firstly, what other alternatives can they work on the next side? Secondly, do people have enough information to meaningfully consent to these new treatments? And finally, what specifically happens in the third world? So in terms of what the alternatives are, right? So like the first half, the negative team tried to tell you that like they would be able to like fast track like treatment development versus funding to be able to alleviate the 12 years. Note here that right after that, they also told you that like the huge amount of time that is used in like development and testing and stuff is for safety and not bureaucracy. We think that like there's an obvious tension here, right? And that if all of the time is for safety, if all of those 12 years is for safety, then they can't like rationally cut like a majority of that time while you're still having like these treatments being safe, right? They pointed to the COVID-19 vaccine. We saw that that one was able to be fast tracked. We think that it's probably like more acceptable to accept that fast tracking is possible. However, two more responses after that. Firstly, we still have that on our side. Like we are able to like offer new treatments before they go through the full process, but we can still also like just as well fast track on our side. But secondly, we think that like neither side should be fast tracking because it takes away like budget from other health initiatives that are better able to like get much more efficient results, right? So stuff like more focus on like mental illness or like pushing out exercise programs or like regimes or like getting like health accessible, making it accessible to people, or even stuff as simple as like free food for kids. We think all of these things can be meaningfully used to like improve general health in like a better way than like just fast tracking like every single medicine, which is going to be incredibly costly and inefficient. Onto the second question under this, which is, do people have enough information to meaningfully consent? Okay. So next main push on this was to tell us that like doctors and companies were corrupt because of the profit motive. 4 responses to this. Firstly, like it's free, right? Like we modeled in our right from that was going to be free. Secondly, like companies aren't going to be like selling these like treatments, right? They're not going to be selling it. Neither are the person going to like get profit from this, which means that there's no like corruption in the way that they say. Thirdly, we also like mechanized to you right from Guy that we were going to have like tons and tons of like regulations, right? Like it has to go through FDA approval. We don't think that companies and doctors are going to be able to circumvent this. But fourthly, even if we take them at their best and assume that what they meant was that doctors and companies wanted to like be able to get like long-term profit from having it be like well known and people like using it more after it's already like finished all of the stages. We tell you that like what matters most then to doctors and companies under the profit incentive is their reputation. We think that if before it has like happened, doctors like before it has gone through all of those stages, doctors like some adverse effects happen. We think that this is really detrimental to the reputation. It's not going to want to do that. In terms of the third world, like firstly, like even people in the third world, like people in the third world know just as well that like their life is like the most important thing, right? We don't think that they're going to like be able to, we don't think it's like reasonable to assume that they're going to like consent. But secondly, we also think that companies have just as much incentive to make sure that people in the third world are informed because it also affects their reputation for 2 reasons. Firstly, like if something goes wrong, if like iatrogenesis occurs, then like journalists and media are going to pick up on this. Secondly, like when death occurs in the third world, we think that like because of the growing presence of internet there, it's going to like pick up traction on social media. We think that's really helpful to the reputation of companies. We think they're not going to like be this negligent. What are the outcomes of this point of life? Firstly, like we literally like saved all of these lives, right? We're like bringing back the outcomes from Guy, which have like we're like able to like save many lives under our side of the house, and we think this is the most important thing for 4 reasons. Firstly, we think that the saving of lives is incredibly personal. Comparing this to like people's like attitudes towards science and stuff, we think that like for most people there's more distance between like a person and like the fear of like medicine and science and like the actual medicine and science involved. We don't think it's like as personal, but for people whose like literal lives like depend on this medicine being available, whose like families' lives depend on this medicine being available, we think that this is the most important thing, that we actually save their lives. And secondly, like in terms of scale, right? Like the comparative is like 12 years of testing and stuff. Whereas under IDIC, like I don't know, like months or like maybe 1 or 2 years, which and with like many people having their lives saved each day, we think that like this far outweighs like the amount of people for whom it might not work for, right? Thirdly, like it's just going to get better like every day and nothing, right? Because science is already getting better, but also like under our side, more emphasis on the early stages of testing incentivizes better improvements and innovations on these early stages, which means that the like rates of success are just going to get progressively much better in future. And finally, note that this point of crash is not contingent on the second point of crash. This is because when faced with like even like taking neg at the best, assuming that people will have like will have negative reactions. We think that when faced with life and death, or like a life full of terrible pain, we think that people are still likely to want to take that last resort of like taking a medicine that they don't fully trust because the only other alternative is so horrible, right? We think that for these people, it can't get worse. We think that it's not contingent. So onto the second point of Clash, which is like what sorts of reactions people will have. 2 questions broadly under this. Firstly, how likely is it that treatments are going to like fail or cause iatrogenesis? Secondly, how do people respond when adverse effects occur, admittedly very rarely on our side? So under the first question, right? Next main push here was to tell us that like medicine works for some people but not for others because the human genome is incredibly complex. Like we just want to like iterate to you firstly that like the human genome is actually like very narrow. Like people share a lot in common genetically with each other. Like the very fact that humans share 50% of the DNA with bananas proves that like humans like genetic makeup is very similar to each other. We don't think that there are like any meaningful differences between like people's DNA, which means that like medicine will work for some people but not for others, especially considering that the most fundamental parts of that medicine target are like for like humans, right, and not for a particular person. Secondly, like companies have the incentive to tap into big markets, which means with the developing nations making up like 80% of the world, we think that they're likely to like make things accessible and also like targeted to be able to help people in the developing world. We don't think they're excluded. Finally, like reminder about FDA approval. Second question, which is how do people respond when iatrogenesis very rarely occurs? They told us firstly, right from like first aid, that like these pregnant women didn't know about the fact that these treatments were premature. So we think that that's already a fundamental difference. But 5 other responses. Firstly, it's overwhelmingly likely that these medicines are going to succeed. Secondly, like people actively consented to this, like knowing the risks that they were running of like the medicine potentially failing or potentially incurring iatrogenesis. Thirdly, before these treatments failed, like normal treatments, the ones that have already been in circulation, had to fail first. This has 2 effects. Firstly, people don't question science. Secondly, there was desperation, which makes people more empathetic towards science. Fourthly, people who need the treatment aren't likely to know other people who also need the treatment. Finally, it's like far more discovered in the times that people's lives have been saved. For all of these reasons, we have the biggest benefits to people.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And now, to conclude the substantive portion of this entire debate and of the in-rounds of Nationals 2021 NZIER sponsored Nationals, we have Tony!
Can you
My battery's not going to last 8 minutes. It's fine. Look, I cannot overstate how irresponsible, how borderline, how grossly negligent it is to give people in states of vulnerability, to give people in states of extreme emotional distress, a drug which could harm or could kill them, simply for the reason that we fed it to rabbits and it didn't kill them. That is irresponsible. That cannot happen. A fundamental principle of the practice of medicine is to do no harm. When you put your health in the hands of someone else, you entrust them with your life, you entrust them with your standard of living, and therefore you trust them with your dignity. Only we are the side of the house that can guarantee people don't walk out of the hospital holding pills that could kill them. This is why I cannot overstate how proud I am to affirm. And again, three questions in this debate: why we can't guarantee safety, why this undermines trust in medicine, and like 2 sentences on innovation, I guess. But firstly, I'm going to talk about the model. So what we heard from AF is that it would be free. That is impossible. Two reasons. Firstly, there is no incentive to do this. A pharmaceutical companies has no reason to waste like a lot of their own money on drugs that have, when there is no benefit to them. And furthermore, when there's an active harm to them because of the risk that things go wrong and the reputational damage we've heard, pharma companies aren't going to risk that when there is literally nothing in it for them. The only potential benefit we can see is that apparently this can make it easier to test. But look, that is absolutely disgusting that we're just going to use these people as like guinea pigs for drugs who could kill them. We think that there is absolutely no instance in which they can just give these drugs away for free. Either they won't do it because they have no incentive to, or they will do it in the most morally repugnant way possible. That is why the model just can't work. Secondly, they talk about how fast tracking isn't possible. Like, talk about fast tracking. Look, the difference between our model and theirs is that when we fast track, we still make sure people are safe. The COVID vaccine is still 100% safe because it went through every single process it needed to go through to ensure it was safe. That is the fundamental difference. Even if they say that they can just get these benefits, they can't, because the fundamental benefit we get is that we don't put people in harm's way. So on to the main points of clash. Firstly, the safety of drugs. First, I'm just going to talk about the incentives of pharma, right? So the incentive is to maximize profit. This is why fundamentally this is incompatible with their model, because there is no way they're going to do things which will risk their like bottom line for absolutely no benefit. So they just fundamentally need to maximize profit. You want evidence of this? So look at the fact that every year thousands of people in the United States die because they can't access insulin, or they undertake their dosage of insulin because pharmaceutical companies charge $90 for a drug that costs $6. Thousands of people die. Pharmaceutical companies still do it to make more money. That is the act that we're dealing with in this debate. Secondly, when they talk about the reputational cost, I'm just going to bring it back to what Julia said around the tragedy of the commons, right? Because the reputational damage doesn't affect one company. The fact that everyone in our team knew about the drug thalidomide, but none of us could name the company which manufactured it, just shows that people don't focus on the companies. They focus on the drugs. They focus on the system as a whole, because people don't go out of their way to do a lot of unnecessary research. This means that if something goes wrong, it harms all pharmaceutical companies, but more importantly, it harms trust in the institution of medicine. That will be my second point of clash. Thirdly, the reason pharmaceutical companies do this is because like some form of self-deluding logic, right? Because in general, people don't just act within moral frameworks. They act and then they decide on the moral frameworks which best suits what they want. The fact that I have to like just give these arguments for why something so clearly morally abhorrent should be considered okay. There's the same like lines of like self-delusion that pharmaceutical companies can use to convince themselves that what they're doing is right. That we don't think we reject the premise that pharmaceutical companies will be good actors and act responsibly. That's just simply not true. Secondly, testing processes early on they say that testing processes early on are sufficient. No, they're not. By their own admission, they're giving people drugs after testing them on animals, literal animals. It doesn't take a scientist to tell you that what happens to a hamster won't necessarily happen to a person, right? Just because something didn't kill a hamster doesn't mean we can start giving it to people. That is irresponsible. That is wrong. But secondly, we will give you analysis down the line around how like medical tests aren't perfect, especially early testing, which is done by companies, not like governmental institutions. They're done by companies which have an invested stake. It is companies which do early tests. It's not governments it's not the like FDA which does later tests. Thirdly, and so next up, I'm going to talk about the incentives on doctors. Again, the same self-deluding narratives about how they're actually doing something good applies to doctors. They can convince themselves that what they're doing is right. Secondly, again, we've told you about how there is corruption, how there's a potential for pressure. There are so many individual incentives acting on doctors that you can't say that they'll never do anything wrong because of the Hippocratic oath. That's assertive, that doesn't contend with reality. Thirdly, they talk about how can people make rational decisions through mechanisms why they can't. Firstly, because they're in an extreme state of distress, of emotional distress. They're in an extreme state of vulnerability. They aren't in a position where they can draw up like a pros and cons list because of the immense psychological distress they're feeling. It's irresponsible to put big decisions about their lives, about their dignities, in the hands of people who are going through such trauma. Secondly, there is a lack of information. Look, we think that really the only people who can make a rational, qualified decision on whether or not to take an experimental drug are someone who has a PhD in medicine, right? That doesn't apply to most people, especially doesn't apply to most people in the developing country. Even if they have some level of scientific knowledge, they are unable to look at all of the factors which determine whether or not something is safe. People can't make these rational decisions. They don't have all the information. Thirdly, the pressures acting on them from everyone else also make it difficult to make their own independent decision. When your family is pressuring you to do something, when like you're being told by doctors that this is what you're going to be advancing the course of scientific research, when you're getting all of these mixed messages going into ears, that is something that fundamentally makes it difficult for you to make a decision. This is why you can't. The principle of just letting people make decisions doesn't apply. They told about how there's a high likelihood of success. Again, that's not true. Just because it didn't kill a rabbit and at best maybe it cured a rabbit's cancer doesn't mean that it can apply to humans. It's not just that we go through these processes to make sure drugs are safe. We also do it to refine drugs, make sure they're effective and most effective they can be. We reject the premise that these drugs will be effective. So let's look at the outcomes of this point. And this is really, really important, right? And this is really, really important, right? Because two responses. Firstly, Even people with terminal illnesses deserve dignity, right? They deserve the right to live the end of their lives with closure, with dignity, with the ability to make reprieve with their loved ones. That is something that is denied to them when they were given this false hope of an experimental treatment they are told can save their lives. They are told can let them single times with their family. And even because, as I've proven, it's unlikely that it's successful, and it's actually quite likely it will harm them. It will cause them. It means harm. It will cause them. It means suffering. We think that we don't think it is fair to them or their families who give them the false hope, rob them of the opportunity to find closure, to find peace. I'll take one now.
Yeah, so we think that this is essentially equivalent to human testing that occurs under your side. So why is it any morally better?
Human testing is regulated. It is done by governmental agencies which act in responsible ways. This is done by companies which are trying to seek profit and are exploitative, especially when they're being exploitative in developing countries. We don't think this is similar at all. Lastly, when we look at the trust in medicine, there's been like a lack of responsiveness here. Down the line, we've told you that the emotional harm leads to fear. People are afraid of medicine. They're afraid to take medicine. We've also talked about how this is exacerbated by misinformation and fake news. We've heard anti-science rhetoric around things like the vaccine, where nothing has gone wrong. Think about what happens when something actually goes wrong. Even for drugs which are safe, drugs which go through these processes, the fact that you have a large segment of the population or a large section of the media which is going to raise fake news, which is going to raise misinformation about the dangers of completely safe drugs, means that you're likely to get people disengaging. We talk about how people are always going to make rational decisions with their life. You have people who are refusing to take a COVID vaccine because of what they read on Facebook. You can't just assert that just because these states are life and death that people make reasonable decisions. That is why they have to accept the harm that people are likely to lose faith in medical institutions, lose faith in the processes to determine what is safe. Lastly, and that is going to cause death, that is going to cause harm. Lastly, on innovation, look, if you're more innovation, invest in the science fair. At least you're not putting people in harm's way. At least you're not putting vulnerable people on the sacrificial altar for the profits of companies or to get more testing done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for concluding the substantive portion of this round. Now, let's have the leaders' replies, as is traditional. They're flipped, reversed, spun round. So let's do that. Let's bring the negating team leader up to give their leader's reply. Looks like it's Julia. Go, Julia! Yeah!
Four things to do in this speech. Firstly, talk about framing in the actual real context. Secondly, talk about safety and who wins that game. Then, with a lot of F's benefits are contingent on that, talk about their path to victory and why they don't achieve it. Then on ours, why we do, and finally, weighing up about who gets the better benefits at the end of the day. Firstly, on the developing world, because F really did not engage with our material on this very much, apart from like brushing it aside and saying that it's not important. But we tell you it is so crucial because the majority of the bad practice going on and the majority of the lives lost is going to be here. We prove a huge harm. You can probably blame it on the fact alone that they didn't engage with this because that's where the largest harms are going to be happening. Secondly, on safety. We tell you 4 or 5 reasons why it's going to be really bad. We got very few responses from F on this. We tell you firstly that farmers like profit motivated and is going to cut corners for that kinds of profit, including misrepresenting results of trials or choosing things that are going to make their drug look really good when it doesn't actually work in practice, especially when it comes to using animal trials which aren't representative at all. The only response we had was like reputation, but we've told you down the line that this is not really going to be at risk because individual drug companies aren't singled out and they also like choose that short-term gain and a huge amount of profit that they're going to get from exploiting people into buying this drug. We think that they're more interested in getting profit in that sense. Secondly, we tell you that like animals are not a true representation of how the drug is going to work just on a principle, like no, like a practical scientific level. So they're not really going to get that efficient drugs and they didn't engage on that. Thirdly, we told you that doctors are likely often, especially in developing countries, to have sorts of deals with pharma companies that then allow them to promote that drug so they can get a commission from that. They just asserted that doctors care. We think that often, like it happens, it doesn't happen every time. We think it happens often enough that doctors care more about money for it to be a tangible harm in this debate, especially in the developing world. It's really, really harmful because people just aren't able to get the kind of information that allows them to do an actual, like rational way up of the harms and benefits. So we tell you that they are going to be uninformed and making decisions that aren't going to be in their interests. So how then does F win? It's really important to note here that everything under F is like contingent on the meds being proved to be safe, which we've already told you is not going to be true in the majority of times. And so like even if they do get a little bit of benefit, they've got so many harms that I'm going to tell you about later on in my speech, they simply can't win. So they tell you that people's lives are going to get better, firstly, that's their main thrust, but it simply won't happen at the point where they're subjecting a lot of people to a lot of trial trauma and actually these really dangerous drugs. Secondly, on innovation, we think you can just like get innovation in other ways, including, as Tony told you, investing in technology. It's really not that important when we're actually weighing it up against people's very lives, so we don't want to give it any weight in this debate. How then do we win? We tell you that all our material, crucially, is not all contingent on proving that it's unsafe every time, even though we tell you that it is true that it will be unsafe the vast majority of the time. We tell you that even at the point where there are some things that are going wrong, then people get a distrust of science because as the affirmative team actually said, media is going to spread that so people become highly aware of it and therefore reject medicine that could actually be saving their lives in the future. Secondly, we tell you that regardless of whether it works, people are being taken advantage of in terms of cost. They might be getting a really small gain or no gain or a real tangible harm and still paying thousands and thousands of dollars that is going out of their paychecks, that is going out of their ability to provide for their families, out of this false hope that Big Pharma is preying on them to provide. And thirdly, there's a really tangible emotional harm when you're pinning all this hope on this drug that simply is not going to work in the vast majority of cases, that therefore means that is like there's incalculable harm to the whole family that is involved with a sick person in this case. So we tell you, we prove all these harms of actually allowing this to happen, whereas the affirmative team doesn't prove any benefits because it's all contingent on safety and they don't prove that it is correct. So what we do on our side is like we directly save people's lives by preventing them from taking drugs that are really bad for them and could actually kill them because they are untested. But further than that, we prevent huge distrust of medical systems in general that could push people away from taking drugs that would actually save their lives, actually properly tested drugs that would actually save them, because you only further misinformation in their side of the house. So we save lives on 2 counts. We also stop so much emotional trauma and so much money being taken away from vulnerable families. That's why we win this debate.
Thanks so much, Julia. Now we're going to flip the flipping, reverse the reversing. I can't remember the other one I said. Spin round the spinning of the round.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah, sounds right. And bring up Guy for the final leader's reply of this debate. Woo! Let's go.
It's vital that we remember the comparative in this debate today. Because like drugs that can save millions of lives every single year are kept under lock and key by governments filling out paperwork, by waiting for trials which are already likely to come back with the positive outcomes that we get and not actually allowing these people to benefit. At their best, they get a few people in developed countries having slightly elevated blood pressure while their like cancer or like chronic illness is actually able to recede. 2 questions in this debate. First, medical outcomes, and like second, on social like and attitudinal like outcomes. Just on our model, we thought like the main contention we got for this was third neg. So we just like to note that like this is probably a little bit late for this to have like a major bearing on the debate. But like we just told you again that the comparative is human trials where pharmaceutical companies have to pay out of their pockets for people to take that. Even if they are only profit incentivized, these people are able to offer these medications for free because the comparative is them actually paying out of pocket. But secondly, we told you about the reputational incentives that act on these companies. We don't think it's okay that like they just assert that like medicine is a monolith, because we see like you literally refer to COVID vaccine by the name, by Pfizer, by AstraZeneca. There's huge brand image there. Starting off on medical outcomes, we gave you 5 reasons from the start which haven't been like engaged with. We told you that like these 12 years are spent doing paperwork. We told you about the reputation. Now you're not going to rush, and the COVID vaccine example. Thirdly, we just tell you like the model, like the modelling is best able to like improve this. Fourthly, we just tell you that these people aren't making these decisions on their own. The doctors are present. Sure, they might not have PhDs in medicine, but they're doctors who are stepping them through this process, who are there every step of the way, do and can talk to them about it. But finally, we just tell you that the promising nature of this thing is really important. But what did they want to tell us? They wanted to tell us about developing countries. Their first main thrust here was like medications not working. Firstly, we just reject assertion. We're all human beings. If you're like a black Botswanan or like a white Briton, we think you like share the same genome, and like it being a little bit hotter in Botswana isn't going to like change if chemotherapy works. But secondly, they have incentives to tap into that 80% market. That's really important. They secondly told us that doctors in these developed worlds are selfish and only profit motivated. We tell you that because these like developing countries are necessarily a little bit more like poor, these people aren't going to be like the corrupt doctors, even if that does happen. But secondly, we just tell you that corrupt doctors is like something that like, even if it does exist, there's a huge harm on both sides of the house, and they haven't made it clear why it's actually worse when we get this different thing. Finally, like, okay. What does this mean? Because we've like shown that like this debate, even if it does take place in developing countries, which you don't think it will, because like big pharma is located in the US, like that is where these things are able to happen, because these like they have that access by like location to that geographical proximity. That like wipes out all their material because that's all they wanted to engage in. They never wanted to engage with the like instance in which this does happen in the developed world, but we've been the team who can like win in all parts of the world. Okay, we tell you that like these are extremely likely to work because normal treatments are failing. That means the comparative is often death. It's not necessarily like these people are like right at the end of their lives. Like even if you accelerate that a little bit, we still like the like proportion that they can actually live out their lives in a constructive way, have that family time. That okay, impacting here, two things. Firstly, we've got like two paths to victory, and that like we either show that the innovation is better because you're able to like get that, like Valentino wanted to split you on and they never really engage with. And that means that you can able to get that approved quicker, get it out to the people. But secondly here, we just tell you that even if 5% of people have like some side effects from that, at their very best, that's still like a very tangible benefit to the other 95% who are able to play with their kids, who are able to live out their best years, and like are not, extremely benefited in this debate today. We propose.
Thank you so much, each and every one of you, for a fantastic debate. I'd like to specifically thank your mascots. They kept me interested throughout this entire tournament, learning the names of them, learning their personality traits. It's really been a thrill for me. I'd like to thank you all for a very interesting debate by itself without the mascots as well. And I think it was a really excellent one. So obviously this is a silent round. We also ask you not to shake hands. So wave at each other, say hi, become friends. But yeah, we just need to leave the room. Coolio.
Can I just ask, first of all, say thanks to everyone. You can take a deep breath, you can relax now, at least for a few hours. And apart from congratulating yourselves, can you please make sure you take all of your stuff with you, because obviously we're not back here again. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.